Everybody, welcome to the April 21st edition of the Special Interest Group, IT, for the FANG, Financial Executive Networking Group. Our top topic today is ERP successes and not so successes. Can everybody see my screen? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on to our next slide, which we want to talk about meeting conduct. And Adriana, can you give a quick thumbnail of the rules of the road here?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's Adriana. For today's meeting, what we're going to do is ask that if you have questions during the presentation, that you post them in the chat and I'll monitor them. That you try to keep, your questions, not too many follow-ups, so that we can give everyone an opportunity to ask the question. What we do ask is that when you put your questions in the chat, that you hold off and don't do any self-advertising or anything like that. Just because, right now this is more about the topic at hand, and we want to make sure that we, get to all that. If there's, you can post your questions to everyone because I'm going to be monitoring it, or you can just post it to me. It's up to you guys. I think that's it.
Thank you, Adriana. Appreciate that. Well, as long as you're talking, let's go ahead. Just a real quick touch point. If we want to go in order here, Adriana, would you just please introduce yourself?
Sure. Oh, sure. Adriana Odis. I'm currently the Director of Finance for the Joseph Lupfer Center for Jewish Life at Yale. I've been a member of the FANG for a number of years. This is the first time I'm co-chairing a special interest group. It's very near and dear to my heart because I find that in my positions, systems and implementing new ones and trying to find things that work together seems to be what I spend a lot of my time doing. So this is a very near and dear topic to me. Yeah, and that's about it. Located here in Connecticut, Milford, Connecticut. Great.
Michael, are you on?
Yeah,
Great.
I am. Nice to see everybody. Mike Goodfriend, been a member of the FANG for, I don't know, let's call it 9 months or so. And first time kind of helping to steer the ship on one of the subcommittees. I'm a consultant and also a CEO at a mid-sized public accounting firm.
Great, thank you, Michael. And I'm Michael Samick. I am a consultant. I've been a member of FANG for since 2012. I headed the Fort Lauderdale, Miami chapter for 3.5 years. I'm a CPA as well as a certified IT professional. And I primarily, for the last 7 years, do ERP assurance for a large consulting and accounting firm. I'm getting an echo. Is anybody else?
Yes.
Okay.
Charlotte, can you check the echo?
Testing.
There's nothing that I can do to stop that. It's on Michael's end.
Okay. Well, I will try not to talk.
Now it's gone.
Yes, no, thank you. That was a little rough. Okay, moving on, we've got 3 outstanding panelists, and I'm going to hand it off to them to do their own introductions. And as soon as we're through that, we're going to jump right into the agenda. So, David, if you would start the process, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
So thank you, Michael. And first of all, thank you to Michael and Adriana and Michael and Charlotte for asking us to participate in this process. So my background is I'm a consultant with Marcum Technologies. I've been a consultant for 30 plus years, working for anything from mid-size accounting firms through global Fortune 500 type accounting firms. Marcum Technology is a wholly owned subsidiary of Marcum. It's a top 15 accounting firm with about 40 offices spread around the country. Marcum Technology has an end-to-end solution set with infrastructure solutions, strategic consulting, cybersecurity, and ERP selection implementation capabilities. So we'll talk more about ERP as we go along, but thank you for the opportunity to participate today.
Thank you, David.
Right.
Tracy?
Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Crawford. I am president with White Glove Consulting Group. Thank you again, Michael and team, for having us on today. White Glove Consulting Group is a consulting company that focuses primarily on business process automation, end-to-end, all the way from marketing to your accounting ERP system, including integrations. We focus primarily in the SaaS and professional services verticals. We do a little more than that from time to time, but really it's mostly with SaaS subscription billing companies that help them optimize and select the right systems and then bring those systems to implementation and fruition. In my previous life, I was actually an accountant, managed an accounting team for a long time for a global SaaS company before I came over to the dark side of consulting here about 13 years ago. So happy to meet everybody and work with you guys today.
Thank you, Tracy.
Hey, everybody. My name is Rich Lupfer. I'm with Cortac Group. Sounds like Tracy and I have a bit of a similar background in that I never thought I'd be a consultant, but here I am. Been with Cortac now for about 5 years, and we're a firm that helps companies basically do all those things that get them in the newspapers in a positive way. The big projects, you may have seen one lately with the Army and Microsoft, and a lot of other large scale transformational programs. We typically are kind of in between the company that is requiring that work, and then say, one of the big like EY or Accenture or Deloitte's, that kind of thing, almost working as an owner's rep or governance in those programs. So we do a lot of project and program management. And then our key niche is really where that commercial world and that DoD or government world kind of intersect. So helping companies navigate and the government agencies navigate the opposite side of that relationship. So before that, I've been FP&A lead, treasurer, controller, kind of you name it on the finance side, M&A. So been around the block on that side. Probably, I need to sit down and count, probably 15 different ERP or other system, similar system implementations over the course of my career. So if it's been done, I've probably seen it, both good and bad.
Yep. Thank you, Richard. So I'm thrilled to have all three of you as panelists, and we're going to jump right into our agenda for today. So let's see if I can get there. Okay. So our first question, I'm going to kick this over to Dave. Why should I be looking at a new ERP system?
Thanks, Michael. The ERP model historically has always been you should be able to do one thing or everything with your ERP system. And what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is that ERP systems evolved significantly. And there are things that the new ERP systems can do that the older ERP systems just struggle with tremendously. And if I could summarize that in probably 3 different ways, is as I think we all know, there's a huge shift to the cloud. And the cloud can provide some phenomenal opportunities for the right situation, the right people. That's one good reason to look at it. Number 2, that we find organizations an awful lot are looking for much better, much more enhanced data analytics capabilities out of these systems. And the data analytics capabilities in the modern ERP systems allow a focused shift from just transactional activity in the ERP to really solving much better the needs of management and the needs of the executives in an organization. And so those analytics and the reporting and the dashboarding capabilities provide some phenomenal capabilities for people to see in a snapshot and a glance what is happening today in the moment, not just what happened in the last 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, but what's the state of things today, and even starting to look proactively what's coming in the future. And then the ability to drill down into information to find much better insight as to what's causing activity to happen, what's the underlying data, and that is really important. And the third aspect really that I think is important with ERPs is ERPs today really don't do the comprehensive things that we all thought they're going to be. With the rise of e-commerce platforms, of standalone CRM systems, of almost return back to best of breed, these modern ERPs create a great focus on integration. So the integration capabilities and the API capabilities of these systems are exceptional, and that you allow a plug and play kind of capability between these systems for data to flow. What we find is we've shifted from an all-in-one system to a need to connect, to integrate, and move data around holistically around the system. These ERPs are just much better at that. So these modern ERPs are great with data analytics. They're great with integration capabilities and really enable this shift to the cloud and all that brings out. So just kind of my perspective and why it's important to look at these new ERP systems. And there's a lot more to it, but I'll let Tracy and Rich chime in on some of those things.
Thank you, David.
Tracy, you want to jump in? Or?
Yeah,
Sure,
Tracy or
I'll jump
Richard,
in next.
feel free.
Yeah, in terms of why you should be looking at a new ERP, I'd say there's really two primary reasons. One, the most common, is that you're growing and scaling so quickly. There's so much going on with your organization that you're unable to get the information and KPIs you need to make decisions at an executive and management level in time to really be effective. So once you get to that point where you say, we have some critical decisions that we need to be making, but we need the data behind it to make those decisions with an educated manner, that's a really good time to be looking at a new ERP system. Another time that customers are looking for a new ERP, even if they're getting those data analytics from another area, is really just around efficiency. So sometimes you have systems in place that require a staff of maybe 20 people to enter a lot of information manually, and you need to get that down to a more streamlined, automated process. So if I was going to summarize why to look at a new ERP, it's really those two reasons you should start to jump into those conversations and see if changing your systems is right for you.
Thanks, Tracy. Richard?
Yeah, I think you really have to look at what's going on in your business. Are you going through something that is a transformational step with your business? Are you going into a new type of business? Is your business changing from, say, maybe high value, low volume transactions to the opposite of that, right? High volume, low value, or something to that effect, right? Are you buying another business, or are you being acquired by another business that has some different needs? And how is that, how are your systems going to keep up? So I think to incur the expense and the disruption, it needs to be something that is really impactful to your business to undertake such a big step. Now, that being said, I would say the other trigger would be if you have significant deficiency. So maybe from a cybersecurity standpoint, you've got leakage, or if you have historically not had clean data management, and basically you've got a big pool of garbage in over the course of time, and you need a substantial reset, not only from a data management standpoint, but from a security standpoint, from a transparency and efficiency standpoint, from a being able to get business done standpoint. Sometimes making the leap to a new ERP system and going through that significant effort is the cleanest, most efficient way to get there. Contrary, even considering the cost of doing so. So those would be the two things that I would be looking at.
Do you find the drivers to be more from the finance side, the supply chain side, the human capital management side, to what would prompt people to look for a new system? Or you also mentioned cyber and data analytics. I'll start with Tracy on that one, if you have any experience.
Yeah, I'm not sure there is one appropriate answer to that. The drivers can come from lots of areas. If we see it coming from the finance accounting side, it's usually because an organization is pre-IPO or has some types of compliance or security issues or accounting issues that they need to deal with where they're not compliant. Like ASC 606 is a great example, right? So sometimes we see that driver coming from the accounting and finance side. But honestly, I see an equal amount of that coming from the executive team or operations, anything from the sales team that says we need visibility into forecasting our pipeline, right, or our resource capacity. So it could very much have to do with actual resource planning, especially for professional services or SaaS organizations. But it really depends. I think there's a lot of different factors that could play into what's triggering the conversation initially.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. So, Richard, there's thousands of ERP products in the market. What's the best method to pick the right ERP system?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think it actually relates to your last kind of follow-up question. You know, what are you trying to achieve, right? Who's asking for the increased functionality, or where are your deficiencies coming from, right? So, you know, there's lots of ways to answer that. There are certainly lots of options. I would break it down, right? Are you looking to go into the cloud? Do you have an on-prem environment? Do you want to change whether that is the case or not? Are you looking for increased capability pertaining to a sales function, right? Are you a supply chain centric company, right? You've got to take a look at what you're looking to achieve, both in the future as well as where you came from, but even more importantly, you know, where you're going, and start narrowing it down there. You know, I have been on my practitioner side at a number of companies where we have gone down this path independently. I would say one of the best things that you can do is go tap an expert. You know, bring somebody in that does this as their day job, and get their help. It's money well spent, because they're going to be completely up to speed with all the feature function capability, the nuances, the gotchas that are out there. And it doesn't have to be a huge expense, but get another opinion. Talk to your auditors.
Yep. So David, I'm going to swing back to you on the same question. So Richard seemed to indicate, you're feeling some pain, which would, potentially drive a decision towards a system and which one to select. But also from in addition to pain, how do you look forward in terms of business transformation when looking to pick the right ERP system?
You raise a really good question, Michael. And one of the challenges organizations do is they pick for the requirements and the feature function fit of today. And whenever we think about an ERP, I like to think that you could be picking a product that you're going to need to work with for 5, 10, 15 years. And you clearly don't want to go through an implementation every couple of years. It's just too expensive, too disruptive to the organization. So part of that starts with, where's the business going? And Richard talked about this a few minutes ago, is what's happening in your business? What are those business drivers? And we all know that business is evolving incredibly rapidly these days for many reasons, such as e-commerce, such as competition. Even COVID-19 has had huge impact on our clients. So understanding and first of all, mapping out where's the business going and where's that future direction and what's the growth that we understand and other new products and market segments we're going to try to address and be in and play with. You want to account for those as well as your current future requirements. When we look at selecting an ERP system, we start with talk about the feature function fit you need to keep your organization sustainable today. Then you need to take into account as where are you going over the next couple of years and what can we start to nail down, right? And prioritize those feature functions based on needs today, needs that are coming, and nice to haves. We also think it's really important you look at price point, right? Obviously, price of both licensing of the software is vitally important, but also the implementation costs. And those can vary wildly based on what you want to have happen right now. The nice thing about ERPs today is you can actually implement systems in stages. You don't need to implement all the features and all the modules today. You can implement core modules and then implement future modules over the next couple of years if you need to. You have that kind of flexibility. The third thing we think that's really important to consider is the vendor itself. And while there are some great vendors out there, not everyone is a good fit for every one of our clients. We want to understand the roadmap of that product and that vendor going forward. Where is that product going? Is it going to continue to service your organization? And is your industry a good fit for where that vendor is going? Second of all, is the support of that vendor here in the US? Can you pick up the phone and get a person that understands your industry, understands your needs, understands your organization? Or are you working through chats and chatbots? Those are really important. Can you pick up the phone, get somebody on the line that you need to when the system is down? Is the vendor going to be flexible in contracting, in price point, and in future evolution of the products? I have a client right now that they want upgrades made for some of the unique needs of the business. And every single time they ask for that, it's an additional cost to the client about supporting those upgrades. So understanding the cultural fit and the business orientation that vendor back to what your needs are is really, really important. And it's important to have a very deep discussion with that vendor about that fit for your industry, your own business, and where that vendor is going forward. So there's a lot of things to consider.
Thank you, David.
If I may, sorry. Before we go on to the next question, I saw a couple of the questions in the chat, and they relate directly to this.
Right.
I think the one thing that we haven't really talked about is assuring that you've got the view of the stakeholders in mind. You know, aside from going outside to get expert opinion, I mean, you've got a wealth of knowledge within your company from all of the various stakeholders within your organization, and acknowledge that a lot of times they only know what they know, right? And it's okay for them to explore different ways. It's okay to ask, should I really be doing this, right? And even come into the room with kind of the question in your head of, is the way that we're doing things really the way that we should be doing them, right? Question everything. In fact, one of the implementations that I went through was kind of interesting. We took out all of the individuals that were doing their day jobs, and all of the key parties were to train replacements for themselves in terms of their day job. And then they got put into this kind of task force team focused on ERP. But the people that we backfilled them with, we were very specific on getting people that were super, super critical on, like, almost to the point of being lazy on purpose, to kind of be like, hey, I hear you. I understand that this is the way you've done it, but why in the world would you do it that way? What, and it really got that team that we're moving on to doing that implementation, that we're guiding that project, to kind of think critically about, wow, gosh, I've got a clean slate here. I've got the ability to kind of forge my own future. I certainly don't want to repeat all of the sins of the past. I don't want to pay all this money and all this human capital to repeat what I have in place now. What would be the purpose of that? Let's come at this from a new, fresh perspective. But pulling that internal expertise is absolutely key. You can't, if you leave this up to your finance team, I mean, I'm sorry, I know we're all finance folks on this call, but you're going to fail. I mean, they're just flat out simple.
Yeah.
Thank you. Adriana, are there any other questions right now?
Yeah, and I think Richard kind of touched on this a little briefly, but there is a specifically can you briefly describe the best practices regarding requirements gathering? Appreciate your views on conference room planning approaches rather than assuming the process owners know what's possible. And I think Richard spoke to that a bit to say, yeah, you need to talk to the stakeholders. And how you do that, the tools you use can vary, but it definitely would be considered, I guess, best practice to not look at this in a vacuum of finance only.
If you don't mind, I want to add just a little bit to this question as well before we move on, because I think David and Richard have made really great points. There's one really common mistake that we see that I think both of them hit on as well, where we decide as a finance organization or part of the organization that you need a new ERP, and then jump right into watching demos, evaluating vendors, and picking a tool, and then going through requirements gathering. I see that all the time. Your process really should be, methodology aside, that you maybe possibly engage a consultant or a team internally to gather your requirements across the entire organization before you even start looking at demos, right? Because you don't want those to influence the decision that you're going to go in. And I think it might have been Richard or David that also said, don't try to rebuild what you're doing today. Don't take your users and say, we need your requirements, write down what you do today. Let's talk about scalability with the executive team and with the users and figure out what we actually need to accomplish the objectives that we've identified, that's driving us to choose an ERP, new ERP. So that's one area I just want to call out to this group, that if you're moving in that direction, definitely engage that team and document your requirements before you even start talking to vendors. And that's going to make your process a lot easier in picking the right one and being confident in your decision.
That's a great point, Tracy. And a lot of organizations, it's a painful process because it takes time, it's tedious, and you need a lot of people involved in that process. So good point. A lot of people try to shortcut that, and it's not a part of the process you want to short circuit.
Michael, can I just add one quick point to this?
Please do.
One of the things as you are gathering those requirements, we see a lot of clients do is they do it by department. And what you end up is a siloed approach. So when we're talking about best practices, it's actually good to think about data and processes as an enterprise-wide flow. And because ERP is designed to be enterprise support, the real focus is how does information flow across your organization? You may want to mix up those requirement sessions with people from various parts of the organization and think about how data and information flows across. And when I've seen organizations do it department by department, things start to break down and you don't get a clear picture of processes-centric models. So just think about mixing that up a little bit as you go through that requirements development process.
Yeah, I'm sure you have lots of examples of that as well. I've seen that. So,
one more thing.
Oh,
I want to add just to this one, because it's directly related to what David said. And I think spending a little extra time on this question is going to help even with the farther ones. But
Absolutely.
To David's point, we get these silos where we say, here's finance, here's sales, here's marketing, here's operations, and talk to them individually. One method that I've seen be really, really successful in helping to break down those silos is to actually assign a lead, just like you would have my accounting lead, manage the requirements there, and a sales lead managing sales. You should assign a lead to any point where there's data handoff. So somebody should own the requirements gathering and understanding the functionality you need, and that sales to accounting handoff, right? Or maybe it's professional services to accounting, just depending on your organization. But having somebody responsible for those areas that cross multiple departments actually helps a lot in just having, accountability and accurate documentation and representation.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank
especially
you.
in a world where your ERP may not be an ERP, right? You might be bringing in several different cloud-based solutions, and you need to integrate those together, and you need to assure that the data from one application gets to the next application in a meaningful, usable, beneficial way. It's not just about the function. It's about the data, the connections, the capabilities, the ease.
Yeah.
Integrity, all those
So
things.
are you saying that as a finance person, I have to know how somebody's entering in a requisition and how they're selecting line items and what general ledger accounts those line items are going to affect? And to Tracy's point, the handoff integration points are critical, and putting the team together almost for the whole walkthrough of all the different cycles is critical. So thank you for all those points. So Richard, you want to answer this or talk to this next question? I don't know if there's a right answer, but certainly I'm sure you've got a little experience
Sure.
with other systems and ERPs you're implementing.
Yeah, I mean, this question really is kind of rooted, in my opinion, in the past. Even, whoa, sorry, Amber Alert here. Let me shut this down. Sorry about that. Great time.
No problem.
No, I think more and more, even if you're going with, say, an Oracle or an SAP or, you know, a Dynamics, you know, it's almost to the point of each module you can implement standalone. You can go best of breed on any one of these. You can mix and match. There are certainly a number of cloud providers and that out there that have gotten very, very specific in order to compete. And they provide one thing and one thing only. And by virtue of going with them, you need to round out that solution depending on what your needs are, right? You may not need a full ERP to be able to get you where you need to go. You may only need, you know, a new sales module or a new planning module or that type of thing, right? So yes, you can go full bore and replace everything in one foul swoop, but it's not necessary. It may not be actually what you need. So, you know, in today's world, the menu is rich. You've got all kinds of options. Which,
So
yeah.
So what would happen, and I know there's a lot of, I'll call it cultural inertia where, you know, a certain corner of the enterprise may love a work order system, and they've dug their heels in. The VP has said, you know, we're not changing, make this work with a new ERP system. How do you address those kind of issues?
No, that's a really good question. I've got a couple clients right now that are focused on that issue. And it's both from how do I integrate legacy systems in to how do I find the hottest, best of breed. I find that an awful lot wrapped around Salesforce. Salesforce is like the new IBM where you don't go wrong if you implement Salesforce for people.
Or buy their stock 2 years ago.
Yeah, I'll leave that finance investment aside. But, you know, I think Richard's point around being able to put things together is a really important one. And we find that not just with Salesforce and CRM, but we also find that with e-commerce solutions. There are some really, really good e-commerce solutions. What I find with ERP systems right now is there's a discussion around what is ERP 2.0? What's that next wave? And the focus around ERP 2.0, as I understand, is really how do we integrate all these components and these pieces together? And as you think about the decisions, you almost need independent decisions around all these components that you want to put together like a puzzle. And you need to do a business case analysis. And hopefully they're quick. Hopefully they're not months to get that done, but can do a quick business case analysis around these things. I have a client that is trying to integrate Salesforce back to NetSuite. And they put it in without doing a business case. What they found is they've spent millions and millions of dollars to put Salesforce in. And they really have never been able to cost justify that. And so we get emotionally attached to legacy systems. We get emotionally attached to new, modern, best of breed systems or spot solutions such as CRM or e-commerce or HRIS. And the real thing to do is step back and put a little bit of logical business case to it. And I think that's where CFOs are really, really important. As a finance organization, the head of that, what we really encourage you to do is get that business case built out and try to understand what the business benefits are, because you know the costs are going to be there. The time and expense to invest in acquiring those new systems, the time for your staff away from doing their day jobs is there. So you better understand what the business case is and why you either want to stick with that legacy system or why it makes sense, what the return is going to be from acquiring and implementing a new best of breed solution, whatever that means. So make sure that that cost benefit trade-off in those things and recognize that that time investment needs to pay back for the organization. It shouldn't be just an emotional decision.
Thank you, David. And Tracy, I know you and I spoke about Salesforce. We touched on that a little bit in a prior call. What has been your experience in terms of integrating maybe specifically Salesforce or other systems, third party with ERP platforms, and how has that gone? And do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think I have lots of thoughts, a lot of reiterating what Richard and David have already said. To the original question, can an ERP do everything that I need? Can it? Possibly, depending on the tool, but should it is the bigger question. Because I think, to your point, Michael, salespeople are passionate about Salesforce. If you're going to try to get them into another CRM, you're going to have an uphill battle, right? So there's just certain conversations you have to have and decide, should we put this all in one system if best of breed is something else? I don't think I've ever worked on a project for medium to enterprise size clients where we didn't have multiple systems. So I think integration is just a reality at this point. We see it all the time. Any company that doesn't do integration probably can't do you much justice in terms of even architecting your requirements and design for you. So I think it's just a reality that you need to account for, especially as you get into figuring out what the cost is going to be.
Well, thank you. I'm going to move on to our next slide. And Richard, I will pitch this question to you. What are the biggest challenges? And I know we've covered some of these items in selecting and implementing a new ERP, and how do I overcome them? Is there anything that we haven't covered in our previous questions that you would like to add?
I think, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about, and we kind of touched on it, on the human capital side of this, right? There is a huge cost to doing one of these, full enterprise-wide, transformational, almost life-changing in some instances, implementations, right? You put an enormous toll on the folks that are trying to keep their day job going and don't break the business. It's kind of the mantra that I keep getting asked to come in and mitigate, right? Don't let us break the business. And at the same time, you're asking those folks that are trying to keep the lights on to completely change, in some cases, the way that they do business, and completely re-envision that and set up and do almost, in some cases, a full second job or even a third job, depending upon the workload and the timing within the program. So I think that's the biggest challenge in my mind. And then too, the risk, truthfully, is that you go through this process and people have this on their resumes, and you go through all the training and all the experience and everything, and at the day when you call done, folks are like, okay, well, this company up the street just called me. They saw that I did this, and they want to pay me twice as much, right? Yep. So how do you mitigate some of that? And do you, right? I mean, you want to see your folks, go on and move forward and do better, but at the same time, there's a massive investment and risk there. And then how do you bring the company along, right? How do you build a culture of transformation into the company?
Right. And what's the definition of a success once you've implemented a new ERP? How do you determine success? Because there's really, from what I've seen, stabilization period post go live. And, you never get everything. There's tens of thousands of details. Yeah. And lots of business processes come out of the woodwork after you go live or leading into go live or in training. So when you're implementing a new ERP and you're bumping into that, so what's I've thought about this, and what's the definition of success? And I'd throw that out to you or anybody else who wants to answer that.
Tracy's got her hand up, so.
Yeah, this is one I'm super passionate about, and I think it's actually even your next slide. Michael and David and Richard and I even talked about this the other day. I'm very passionate about defining exactly what success looks like, because we've talked a little bit about make sure you gather your requirements before you even start looking at vendors. You understand what you're trying to accomplish and change. Really unfortunate common mistake that we see is that people rush into picking a system, they replicate their requirements, they spend all this money migrating and all this time, and it's painful. And to Richard's point, there's the human capital. Everybody's got to work 2 jobs. And then at the end of the day, they're like, okay, was that successful? And nobody knows. And the reason they don't know is because they did not properly define what their measurements of success and what they were trying to accomplish were before the start of the projects. Instead, they said, here's our budget and our timeline, and they're using that as a yardstick. But you might come in under budget and on time on a project and be in the exact same position or worse than you were before you came into your new ERP. So whether that measurement of its success is I want to change my month end close from 15 days to 5 days, like that might be one, or maybe I want to decrease my days outstanding on accounts receivable by 25%. Those are conversations you should be having before you get into the implementation process. So even as you're defining and architecting what the system's going to look like, the entire team has those kind of like goalposts in their mind to say, we need to design it this way if you're going to meet these success criteria.
Great point, Tracy.
I think too, oh, sorry, go ahead, David.
Well, the other thing that's really, really, really important about that is Tracy's right. You've got to have those metrics and KPIs. Think of that as your dashboard through the project. But it's very, very important you establish those baselines of numbers prior to starting the project. You have to know that your days to close is 15 days so that you can move it to 5. You have to know that your inventory level is XYZ and that you want it to be ABC before you're done. If you haven't baselined at the beginning of the project, you can't really tell whether there's improvement out there. And likely what you also want to do is make sure that there are financial metrics, not just in finance itself, but also in operations, also in sales, and other areas of the business. You can be really successful in finance and blow up sales. You can blow up operations. And unless you've got metrics across the area, it doesn't have to be 50 in each area, it could be 3 to 5 in each area, but you want to know about trade-offs and that you're not blowing up customers, you're not blowing up vendors, as well as you're going through this process. So just think holistic about metrics in each area, think about a few, think about measurement before you start, and then measurement at the end so you can track, and 6 months to a year afterwards as well.
Thank you, David. Richard, were you?
Yeah, one of the questions in the chat kind of speaks to this, and we talked about it a little bit on a prior slide too. You know, can an ERP system do everything that you want? You know, everything under the sun, right? I would argue that it shouldn't, right? You've got to go through, when you're going through the requirements gathering process, of determining what is a have to have and what is a nice to have, and then what would be, you know, like Christmas in July kind of thing, right? And figure out, you know, at what point, you know, do you measure, or at what point in achieving those have to haves and the nice to haves are you considered to have been successful? And you should know that up front, right? That should be a key part of your criteria in determining whether you are ready to, you know, go no go at that stage. You know, I was just talking with a friend of mine. She was celebrating having gone through having just finished and launched a 6-year implementation. Now it's a Fortune 10 company, so yeah, large scale, but wow, 6 years. I mean, you poke my eyes out. Unless I was the consultant getting paid on that. I mean, that'd be beautiful. But I mean, how crazy is that? Like we talked about human capital. Right? That I would not consider that a success. Like, how disruptive to the business would that be? I don't care what kind of system it is, you know, to have to go through that for that amount of time. And chances are they probably wanted everything, right? So, and I'm speaking a little bit uneducatedly, but I mean that milestone just kind of hit me the other day. Whoa, this must have been one insane implementation of some crazy system. I think it's that mitigation of risk and that making sure that that you know up front what your have to haves are.
So,
Right.
if I could add one quick piece in that, one of the things I've seen is clients trying to get the ERP to do everything and anything possible. Right? We're going to automate every possible thing. There's the huge risk that you take the ERP into space that it really is not designed to handle. And you over customize and over engineer that new solution, and you actually cause worse problems than you ever had before because you've highly customized and forced that ERP into a box that's not designed to do. And you find yourself with custom code that's not upgradable. You find yourself in functionalities that just don't make sense. Part of the challenge is doing a trade-off between what can that ERP do and what should it do? And those are not the same things. And it is really important to ascertain that and not try to force fit an ERP into a business situation that it really shouldn't be doing. Sometimes it's better to modify the organization's policies and procedures and controls, rather than trying to get that ERP to do everything.
Yeah, especially in today's day and world where you've got to connect so many different systems, and the farther you get away from off the shelf, the more risky those integrations and APIs become in terms of being able to communicate, because everybody's building their application based upon standard, right? You need to be able to communicate to this other application. You need to tie into this other process. The only thing that they have to work on for what they are selling to the mass market is off the shelf. Now, the paradox to that is if something that you're doing is a competitive advantage and it's different than everybody else, well, then you've got to kind of question, is that competitive advantage worth that customization and the risk that it brings?
Yep, good points. Thank you. Okay, Tracy, you had mentioned data analytics before. What type of reporting and data analytics should I be looking for in terms of reports, queries, dashboards? Can you maybe talk to your experience a little bit and, maybe some of what clients wanted and then what clients didn't know they wanted, but served a great purpose. So I kick that over to you.
Sure. So this is another area that would vary a little bit by department, but it is important that the organization looks at it holistically. The accounting team is really going to be looking for those key metrics on what they're trying to improve. So you should be able to bucket it and say, these are the reports and the things that I'm doing today that I have to have, and then this is what we're trying to do better. And how am I going to track that? Ability to recognize revenue properly according to ASC 606 is great. Maybe compliance with tax is great. And there's things you can start with there. But there's often a lot of more operational, I would say, data analytic points that need to not be overlooked. This, again, can be very true for the sales side. In the SaaS space, that might be like customer churn, increase in MRR, upsell, uplift percentage on renewal deals and things like that. They can go even further into saying, the strategy of my organization is to launch a new product and to maximize our cross-sell potential to our existing customer base, right? So if something like that needs to be accounted for all the way from the sales side to say, how do I identify who my customers are and what they have and who my sales team should be spending their time chasing, that's an area that you might want to focus on. And then that goes all the way end to end, because the way that sales team is selling those deals, the way they're focusing on those customers, the way they're writing their contracts, even the legalese, has a direct impact on your accounting team. Just a few words in their contract terminology might change how you're recognizing revenue for that deal or that performance obligation, for example. Great. So I know a lot of it's kind of a wide range of scenarios, but it really does depend on, what you're trying to accomplish with this new system.
Thank you, Tracy. So David, in the implementations you've been involved with, traditionally, finance has owned a good chunk of data analytics, but with ERP systems, do you find the numbers and the crunching and the analysis gets more decentralized to those owners and stakeholders that have a more vested interest in seeing those operate, or do you see finance continuing to drive that process?
Well, like all good consultants, we say it depends, right? I think that's the objective, is decentralized reporting and data analytics and make it more amenable to the user. There still is some work to be done to understand the best way to generate reports out of some of these systems and to build customized dashboards. The modern ERP systems have role-based analytics where you can specify who can see what, how they can drill down, what layers, what depth, things like that. So they're incredibly flexible. The challenge is it still does take a little bit of practice and experience to be good at these things and to make that happen. So while we want operations and sales and all those things to be generating their own reports, do we seriously want salespeople to spend the time to craft reports and craft dashboards, or do they just want to be consumers of those kind of things? The one other thing I would say about reporting and data analytics is in these systems, there's kind of a shift from that retrospective look back, right? Reporting is very focused on what happened 30 days ago, or the last period, or the last quarter, or the last year. What's the year-over-year analysis? What the modern analytics tools are trying to get you to do is think in real time. What's the state of the situation of the company right now? Cash position, receivables, inventory on hand, all those kind of activities. And even start to shift into a predictive and prescriptive kind of model. Tell me what's going to happen in the next 30, 60, 90 days. Tell me why it's going to happen and help management make better decision points. Are we good at that? No, we have a lot of work to do, but that's where these systems are trying to get to, is getting better insight, not just for transactional activities, but really at the executive layer. How does the executives, the CFO, the CEO, the owner, the president, the COO make better decisions in real time about what's happening? It's coming, and I think they're better than they used to be. But it still has a ways to go to really get there.
Thank you, David. So, Richard, do you in your implementations, have you had a significant piece in terms of data analytics and the consumers of that type of information? And has that also been some of the external stakeholders as well as the internal operators, both finance and supply chain?
Well, so here's my thought on analytics. With the tools that are out there today, anybody and everybody should be able to do analytics. The centralization of that analytics process or those reports should, in my opinion, be limited to only those that are going to the executive levels. Everything else should be distributed. Teams should be able to do their own analytics. Now, the catch with that is that different groups have different definitions of what is a customer, what is revenue, right? I've been at companies where there were 8 different definitions of revenue, and every single one of them were right? Depending upon the circumstance, depending on the perspective, depending upon the report, depending upon where it was in the system, right? So the best thing that any company can do from an analytics standpoint is put in a culture of master data governance and transactional data governance, enterprise data governance, call it what you want, MDM, whatever label you want to put on it that doesn't scare people away, and get those data stewards to sign up from within the business to be able to take accountability for their data, define that data, create a standard, transparent, accessible data dictionary where you can go in and have a term, define the term, set parameters as to where it applies, in what piece of the system, what piece of the process. And then at that point, once you have those things in place and you've got controls around them so that you can't, and before you put data in the system, don't start with garbage in and then hit the cleanup to get to a good state, right? Clean up your data, implement the system, put controls in so once you clean it up, you don't mess it up. I call it get clean, stay clean. And then at that point, analytics becomes infinitely more powerful, democratized, and standard. And anybody can go in at any level of the organization. Say you've got somebody that's brand new to the organization and wants to make a name for themselves and wants to hit the ground running and do these awesome things, and they have a really analytical mindset and they got access to the tools and they want to go, improve ARR by 5 days because they found this thing. Well, empower that, right? But you've got to have the environment ready to be able to do that. That's my opinion on it.
Yeah, you said something interesting for me is finding somebody who's got some of the tools. In some of my experiences, people pop up in the strangest places in terms of having an interest and the ability and sort of the understanding of the business processes to get up to speed on some of the tools and data analytics. Has that been your experience as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's funny because I think a lot of times it's the introverts within your organization, right? They're just like, well, you know what? I've got this idea and I can go prove it and we can make it happen. And they'll go dig in and they'll find the tool, whether it's Excel, whether it's Power BI, whether it's, Tableau or what have you, right? They'll just go create it and make it happen. And then they show up when they're like, hey, by the way, I just did this thing.
Yeah.
whoa, this is amazing. Yeah, absolutely. You never know.
Did we lose?
And Michael, one of the things I would think about as we talk about reporting data analytics is some of our clients are really starting to build out a organization to govern and set some policies and procedures around data management. And Richard started to talk about that. The complexity when you're talking about a large scale ERP that may take 6 years to implement, you probably need some data governance policies, and that's probably a combined group of people from across the organization that, as Richard talked about, is a little bit more introverted, a little bit more willing to do data analysis and figure that stuff out. But setting some governance process and setting some structure for that across the organization about what makes sense and how do we keep that data clean, how do we stay clean, is really, really important. So as you think about an ERP implementation, it's important to go into how do we manage this data? Data does have an age and a life cycle to it. And as data ages, it becomes much less relevant. And is there an archival process? Or as you change things like a chart of accounts, does that change the way we think about some of this data? And so just getting the ERP implemented is kind of step one in this process, but also thinking about data management, data governance policies, think about business processes and how these pieces come together. There's more to it than that. And just the implementation is really step one, but it really becomes how do you start thinking about managing all this complexity that you're introducing into it. So.
Thank you, David. I had a connectivity problem. So Tracy, I don't know if you had a chance to talk to this or not. I may not have heard.
On this current slide, re-engineering business process?
Yes. What does
no.
it mean? Yep. And if you can talk a little bit about your experience.
Absolutely. You know, I think, Michael, it just really ties back to a lot of what Richard and David and I have been saying as well, in terms of when you're re-engineering your processes, you don't want to try to rebuild exactly what you're doing today in your new system, right? Make sure that you have the end game in mind and you're working towards that and engineering your system for your future state and for scalability. I think that David's points on data governance and Richard's as well are really important, because it's easy when you're implementing, especially multiple systems with integrations, to overlook system of record and who should really own what data points. And even to David's point, you know, the number one project or the number one reason that any project fails is actually data. It's across the board. Research documented data is the number one cause for failure. And that's either taking garbage data out of your existing system into your new one, or just not thinking through how your new architecture needs to receive that data. So all those things need to be considered when you're re-engineering that business process, because that equates to changes in the way you need to potentially manipulate and re-upload your data into a new system.
Do you find as you're going through the implementation process that the blueprint or foundation that you were defining prior to this as how you would proceed changes as far as re-engineering business processes as people learn more, your clients learn more about what the system does and get a deeper understanding, or is it a pretty static process in terms of re-engineering?
It depends. I think if an organization goes into a new ERP the right way and allocates the time and the budget up front to say, let's document our requirements, let's pick the right vendor, let's architect our solution, and spend honestly probably a third of your budget for implementation on just picking the vendor, requirements gathering, and architecture, then the changes you're going to see in business process and re-engineering as you get into development and testing will be much smaller. So even though you're spending more of your budget up front, it's going to save you time and money in the long run. companies that don't do that, that say, let's just go straight to getting demos from vendors. Ooh, this one looks pretty, let's get this, and then start to build out those requirements after purchase and then change those through the process. You know, that's actually where we usually see more of your scope creep and increase in budget and having to just completely scrap things sometimes and rebuild them. So we see it happen both ways, definitely in my opinion, and I'd love to hear what Richard and David say. The smarter approach is to just say, you know, allocate this much budget just to planning and design, you know, and spend the time, because you all might have heard the saying, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Go a little slower at the beginning to get it right, and then the rest of the project will go quickly without bumps, generally speaking.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Kick that to David and then Richard.
So I think there's 2 or 3 things in there. On the whole re-engineering business process for a minute, I think it's really important to think enterprise-wide in those processes. And there's probably a set of main processes that flow across the entire organization, which goes back to one of the things I mentioned a few minutes ago about bringing different departments, different groups together to work through those business processes, like procure to pay, right? Is let's think of all the people who are going to get touched in that process, and how do we understand handoffs correctly, and not think about departments, but think about a process-centric perspective on that. One of the things that we think about in the selection process is, as we define requirements, there's a requirements document that we build out. We build that out through interviews and document collection, and really work through with the staff about what needs to be in there from a process centricity to those pieces. Now, honestly, there are 2 ways to think about getting vendors to comply with those requirements. One is to run an RFI, RFP process, where vendors are certifying, and you take those vendor responses into the contracting process and hold them accountable that they're going to have to deliver against what they certify they can deliver against. Another way to do that is when we run demos, call it manipulative, if you will, but we overload the requirements and shorten the time cycle for delivering against those requirements in the demos. So what we try to do is push out this shiny ball syndrome, where the vendors are like, look over here, we've got these really great user interfaces and things. But when we ask them to demo against a specific set of requirements and load those requirements up and see what really is in there, and potentially ask them to demo against clients' data, then you can push out shiny ball syndrome, because they have to hit those requirements first and foremost. So you can call it manipulative of us, but what we're trying to do is get the vendor to focus on what the client really wants to see, not what the vendor wants to show you. And so we got to manage those demo processes very, very tightly and script them tightly, so that we prioritize what the vendor has to show the most important requirements first and foremost.
Great process. Richard, did you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I think the one thing that kind of comes to mind, and we haven't talked about it too much, is change management. And I really feel strongly that you can't overinvest in change management. I mean, obviously you can't, but I mean, like, nobody ever does. You start building a culture when you start bringing the entire business into this process. You hold people within those functional areas accountable, and they provide that input. But even then, the amount of re-engineering and the impact on the business and the way that it changes people's day-to-day functions and interactions and all of those types of things still is super, super impactful, right? David talked about procure to pay. I mean, I've seen companies come to their knees because they didn't do change management around procure to pay, and literally the doors to the building will be closed because the landlord didn't get paid that month, right? You know, that's really simple to solve. Somebody on the end that received that PO that needed to approve within a system didn't know how to go to click on a certain field, right? They weren't educated. Their hand wasn't held. They didn't, you know, that change management process failed. The system worked perfectly fine. The person broke down, the process broke down, the education broke down. So I think change management is one of those areas that you know, you got to buy in 100%. And you got to do it over and over.
Yeah, let me ask you a related question, because I think it's, and I agree with you, it's probably the most important thing to emphasize. But, you know, what if you get in a situation, and this probably has happened to you in some form or fashion, you have your, I'll call it the project team, the people that are assigned for the ERP conversion, and then they report up, right, to either the controller, the CFO on that side, or an operations person. What if you don't get the buy-in from their boss from a change management perspective? Is that important? And does that affect you?
So what
for
I have
example,
seen-
go ahead.
What I have seen work the best is that you've got the working group that's actually in the trenches doing the work, doing the implementation. But then you've got a steering committee that's at the executive levels that are, you know, chief marketing officer, you know, your head of sales, the controllers, the treasurers, the CFO, the head of IT, those folks, and that's held as a committee, as a council, and say, you know, your chief marketing officer probably has a director of marketing that is tied into the, you know, the work being done. And yeah, they've got to get that person on board, or not, if it's something that they don't agree with. But, you know, you've got two levels of kind of governance in place. And yeah, I mean, you know, this isn't a rubber stamp exercise. You're going to have times when that leader is not on board. And that's where you got to step back and say, okay, well, we have the process in place. What else broke down, right? Do we actually have an issue here? Was it a lack of communication? Did somebody go on vacation for a week and didn't, you know, communicate up? Like, but you got to find out. You got to figure it out, right? You got to, if you've got the right structure in place, then there's a follow-up, and it may be a simple answer. It may be a really complicated answer, but you go and find out, right? You question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, great. And I would also throw that over to David and Tracy, and maybe you can, if you have any war stories, and I'm sure you might have one or two, in terms of change management and either resistance, and how do you address that, and what's the best structure to manage that process?
So I think a steering committee is vital for a project of this scale. One of the core challenges is that people are looking for direction all the time, because in some sense we've thrust them into an environment that they're unfamiliar with the technology, they're unfamiliar with process change, trying to focus on their day job. And fundamentally, people follow the leader. If the leader checks out, if the leader resists, if the leader just goes in a different direction, people will follow that leader. And so it's not just having a steering committee, it is making sure it's an engaged and directive steering committee, and that there is a process for resolving conflict and documenting decision-making. One of the most critical things I see in a project is, what did we decide, who decided it, and when, what does that mean for everybody, right? We quite often, I don't know about you, but I walk into a lot of clients where there's a lot of status meetings and there are no decisions made. And what people happen is they make assumptions about, oh, we decided this, where somebody else decides this, where somebody else decides that. It goes back to Richard's point about there are 8 different definitions of revenue. There's 8 different definitions of what a decision was and what was made, and you get conflict. And so you have to be clear in those status meetings that what are the decisions that are made? What does that mean? Who made those decisions? There's clear leadership, and what's the direction of that steering committee? So all these subtle things are really important to make explicit along the way, and that people know where the organization is going. And it seems subtle, but it's really, really important that the team is aligned around common decisions, common direction, and that the leaders know they have a lot of responsibility in formal and not so formal ways.
Great, thank you. I don't know, Tracy, if you had anything you wanted to say on this topic, or if you'd like me to move on.
There's not a lot to add. You know, I think your question, Michael, how bad is it going to be if you don't have buy-in from the top or involvement from the top? And that can make things get ugly really fast. So at the end of the day, you need to make sure that you have a very, very solid program manager overseeing this this whole operation internally. Either that or somebody that you contract with that's 100% dedicated to this project that can handle these project management nuances that David's talking about, making sure that we document, making sure we make decisions, we document those and send them to the appropriate parties, and really driving those change management initiatives internally. If you don't have that and you're switching to a new system at scale, especially, then you're bound to have some pretty major issues.
So you wouldn't recommend the CFO do that part-time, is what you're saying?
No, absolutely not.
Thank you.
One thing
yeah.
to add on the change management for any of you that are working in international companies, this can be a real gotcha if you are working in Europe. Because at the point when you start changing the way that people do their jobs, you start getting into legislative, government controlled areas, wherein changing the way that people do their jobs can sometimes be illegal, even if it's for the benefit of the company, or to improve process change in general is a difficult subject, or can be in some countries in Europe. So just be aware of that, plan accordingly, allocate resources and time, but know that it's going to take some dedicated attention.
Great. This next slide, we've pretty much covered this topic previously, and I think the how long is question is, it depends. I think, David, you've taught me that response very well. It depends on many, many things. So unless you all have anything you want to comment on this slide, I'm going to move on.
I have just one very quick thing, because I feel like we've talked about it a lot. But in terms of best practice, I would say just make sure that when you're doing an implementation, scope your discovery and design and architecture separately from implementation. And that's really going to help you manage the budget and expectations to say, here's my SOW just to architect and figure out how much work this is really going to be and what's in scope and what's not, versus just signing a contract, say, let's go build it. And then you start to go over budget, 8 months in when it's too late, for example.
Right.
And then I would say also that it's okay to do a phased implementation, meaning you get the nuts and bolts in place in the first round, and you have a go no go for keep the lights on, and then all the bells and whistles, and any of those gaps that maybe despite best intentions, despite implementation, the way that you planned still don't work for the business, and you've got to go back and re-look at some of those. It's okay to go back and have almost like a second implementation, right? A phase 2.
That's an interesting question. I throw this out there, Richard. Is it better to get childbirth with this ERP over in one shot and try to get everything done and not burn everybody out over a longer period? Or is it better to try to make it more edible in terms of the size of the dinner on your plate? How do you address that?
I think if you're doing the implementation for the right reasons, and you're doing it the right way, I think the only good way is to do it in a multi-step process, because you are going to learn things about your business. You're going to learn things about your people and your processes that are going to change the outcome, right? If you're going to a new software platform that does things that you have never envisioned your business doing before, you're probably not going to get that on the first round. Chances are you're going to need a second round to be able to really make that full transformation. So that's just my opinion. The people holding the purse strings may differ completely in my opinion.
David, you have any thoughts on that in terms of all in one shot, or stretch it out in edible pieces, or you burn people out? And obviously budget is a major concern. And don't want to minimize that, but just thinking in terms of success.
I'd say it depends, right? It's a good consulting answer. I think it really depends on the client, the situation. I agree with Richard 100%. You're going to learn stuff in that first phase, that you can make things better in the next phase. I think it's also can be beneficial if you stage the phases around modules or processes and step into some of that stuff in a graceful form. I will also say I've seen clients where they get partway through the project, they're incredibly burned out, and you need to get the project over the finish line. And you can stage a second phase in that, but you may need a break. And you absolutely need to find a way to declare success after the first one, give people hope that they're not going to get just thrown underneath the bus, from their perspective the second time. Some of it is really important to stage it in the right way. And this is where communications and messaging and recognizing what your staff can tolerate and can't tolerate. I hate to say there's a rule of thumb. I think multi-phase projects are phenomenal. You are absolutely going to learn from it. You're going to do it better. You're going to make your team better. It's a trade-off between continued improvement and capacity of the staff to absorb those kind of scale of changes that are going to go on.
Right. Thank you. Hey, how much do these cost, by the way?
Who gets to answer that first?
Yeah, right. Tracy, you spoke, you answered.
There is no easy way to answer how much this costs, right? That's everybody's first question. But you have to understand not only the cost of the system and the recurring cost just for a SaaS product if you're moving to the cloud, but also if you have integrations, implementation, ongoing support, things like that, even internal maintenance. The system you pick itself can range so much depending on if you're doing a smaller size ERP solution that's, under 50 grand a year to anything. I mean, I've seen it closer to $500,000 a year, just annual cost for subscription only, right? So it's pretty hard to say, and I don't want to necessarily beat a dead horse or keep repeating myself, but I do think that the process of engaging the right team members and people up front to really decide what you need and which system it's going to be and architecting before you get into implementation is going to help minimize this question, right? Because you're going to be more confident in your answer because you've talked through and designed and discussed all these nuances and really figured out what the end game looks like. So that way your budget variance is going to be a lot lower.
Great. I think I'm bumping up against the deadline, so I want to get through, I think a couple slides are left. If we can't get through them, I want to try to leave some. Adriana, are there any questions that are coming up?
I think some of them we've been answering, but one that actually was pretty thoughtful came from John Nichols. He said, any thoughts on best practices for establishing the GRC requirements, the governmental and regulatory requirements such as for SOX, SOC, PCI, GDPR, etc. when you implement in an ERP? Are GRC models or third-party software integral, or can this be accomplished in other manners? I mean,
sure. Let's throw that out to our panelists. Would anybody like to answer that question?
I can jump on that unless someone else wants to jump in first.
No, please go ahead.
Pretty core to what we do. So, I think the second half of that question kind of dictates a little bit of the first part answer. Your GRC platform is not your ERP. They are two separate and distinct processes, two separate and distinct systems. Yes, there are things impacted within an ERP that you need to set up appropriately, but your GRC platform is by design set to be able to track, to monitor, to document, and signal, proactively the timing of which you go back and do those reviews, where you find the documentation, so on and so forth, right? The underlying controls may or may not be in your ERP that you need to abide by. So it's almost one references the other, but they are two separate, distinct processes and systems. Where you start crossing over lines is when you get into your audits and your internal audit function. They may be using both systems, but certainly not in similar ways. So I think that's probably a whole nother topic that it would be excellent for CFOs to better understand. Maybe something we want to cover in the next session.
Great, thank you, Richard. Yep. Anybody else have anything to add, David or Tracy? If not,
Let's go on. That's a topic in and of itself, and there's a lot in there. So
yeah, so this screen is also a topic in and of itself. Cloud-based ERP systems, and what is the cloud, and what are you doing in the cloud? Maybe David, you can start this off, and then we can have a relatively short discussion in case there's any other questions from the audience.
I'm gonna keep this, try to keep it really short and simple. You know, the pressure from the cloud is coming a lot from the vendors. And on one hand, and we talked about this in a prep activity a little bit, is the vendors view this as an opportunity to increase revenue and create a continuous recurring revenue stream. And so we need to, anytime you're considering a cloud solution, you need to understand all the costs, benefits, and trade-offs between on-premise, hosted, cloud-based. And those are three truly different models. But I would say the prospect of, you know, there are some benefits. Hopefully, you can reduce IT support. That's not always true, but that's one of the objectives. You have to be clear about what you're going to do to get that. You have to understand that you get automatic updates. That can be a benefit. Hopefully, you get better security than a lot of our clients can get on their own. But you need to drill in and validate all those things. You need to understand the requirements. You need to understand how settings are made in cloud. And what the trade-offs. And I think this is one of those areas that it's helpful to have an expert. But I would say that from my perspective, all the vendors are going to end up in the cloud at some point. One way or another, the data is going to be in the cloud, the system is going to be in the cloud. And this is worthy of a lengthy conversation in and of itself, but that's where I see all the vendors getting to at some point.
Yeah, and I think we will put that on for later in the year to have a dedicated panel to discuss this, and would hopefully you all would be available. Tracy, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Not really, Michael. I think David's answer was really spot on. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish, and I think at this point, making sure you really vet out those vendors and their security and their data models and the legalese in their contracts is going to be really important to make sure you're picking the right one that's safe and trustworthy, depending on what you need. Great.
Well, I want to thank everybody for attending, and especially the panelists, because I've learned a lot, and they had some really wonderful insights. Do we have any other questions that we want to open it to the floor? I know we only have a couple minutes. Okay, well, I don't think anybody else's questions. Adriana, can you see any questions?
No, just more comments, which are pretty good, and I actually did save the chat. So I'll send it out, that, you know, talking about the ERPs and some of the challenges, bottlenecks with respect to networking issues that were pretty difficult to diagnose and fix. And of course, those types of things can obviously cause delay to your product. For this instance, with a net, it causes 2 to 3 month delay for Oracle, the consultants, and even IT before the issues are resolved. So again, going back to that question of, you know, trying to figure out all your pieces, even with as diligent as you can be, there may be some things that really don't come to pass until you start to get into the project itself. I think one of the last ones was, where in the process is the prospect qualifying stages, meaning a company would like to transition to an ERP, but the majority neglect the mindset change needed. I think we talked about this in the beginning, of really trying to determine, spending the time up front to get buy-in and to really identify what is it that you're trying to resolve, identify those questions first before diving into, oh, this is the pit, this is what we want to do.
Okay.
Yeah. But I did save the chat, so I'll send it to the panelists and to you guys, and then we'll figure out maybe there's a way we can share it with the group.
Great. Thank you, Adriana. I want to personally thank David and Tracy and Richard. All of them you can find on the web or LinkedIn. And if you need to reach out to them and can't find them, shoot an email to one of the board members here, and we'd be happy to connect you with David, Tracy, or Richard. And thank you so much for everybody for participating. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we will certainly respond.
Could I ask a very quick question?
Sure.
I just wanted to ask the panelists, going forward, are companies going down more towards the cloud-based solution for ERPs, or is on-premises or hosted still considered more kind of like favorable?
Awesome.
I think hybrid solutions are going to be, it's kind of like the pendulum swinging, right? We used to all be on-prem, then the cloud got, to be this, this hot, sexy product. I think the end result is going to be somewhere in between. You're going to have some processes that in your own either in your own data centers or in hosted data centers, and there's going to be some things in the cloud. Not everything is always, well suited for one or the other. So I think it's going to become a mixture. But we'll see. We'll see how good contracts remain. To Tracy's point, you got to be careful what you sign up for. We'll see how much companies really want to manage their infrastructure, right? I mean, there's a huge cost to that.
Yeah.
But there's also flexibility too.
One of the things that's popular in Florida, being in Hurricane Alley, is cloud providers are saying, well, you have, you store your data off-site and it's real time. Well, that's great. How do you get there? How do you have your people in the case of a disaster access it? I see you smiling, Tracy. I think that there's 1,000 considerations for that type of DR that's being, I think, sort of subtly sold as part of the cloud. It's certainly something that Richard, I think you were alluding to in terms of the pendulum and how people own their manage their data. So that's still to be seen, I think. Okay, well, I think we've bumped up against our deadline. I want to again thank everybody for participating. The panelists, thank you for your questions. To everybody who's joined. Thank you to Charlotte, who's enabled this, and to our other board members, Adriana and Michael. Thank you so much for helping out. And with that,